Hello, my name is Ken Pfeiffer and I will present to you our research on multimodal user interfaces in VR. This work was conducted in collaboration with Lukas, Sarah, Mariam, Hannah and Florian from the Bundeswehr University and the LMU in Munich, Germany. Our work investigates new interaction methods for handheld menus in VR. A good example is Google's Tilt Brush, an application where users can design in a 3D environment by directly drawing with their controller in 3D. As you can see, the user is holding a menu in one hand, while the other hand is using the controller like a virtual pen. This reveals a very common interaction sequence where oftentimes the users shift their attention between drawing something and then interacting with the menu. This research is particularly concerned with this fundamental context switch. What happens is that every time the user wants to select a new color or a new mode, the user is first looking at the menu, then moving the dominant hand towards the menu, then selecting the mode, and then returns the hand to the intended drawing location. However, if the designer is in situations where they have to frequently change modes, this can get quite tedious. The user is detracted away from their main focus to the menu. The manual movement can lead to physical effort and can also be time-consuming. Our idea in this paper is to explore how eye tracking in VR headsets can enhance menu interfaces. So the user will always look at the menu when interacting with it, and even before moving the hand towards the menu. The eye movement therefore reveals the context switch to the menu. Nowadays there are lots of different headsets that have eye tracking capability. For example, the HTC Vive. These eye trackers work accurately after a one-time calibration. Therefore, we explore the novel concept of using gaze interaction with the handheld menu, as illustrated on the right. The idea is that when the menu is held up, the user can simply look at the menu item they want to select. This saves the user manual effort and allows an implicit activation of a button at a glance. Based on the literature, we distilled 3 variants to enable gaze selection in a handheld menu: the cursor technique, the gaze button technique, and the dwell time technique. The techniques are essentially enhancements of 2 existing manual techniques. We explain them before we dive into gaze interaction. The dunk brush technique is direct. Users directly move the controller into the button to select it. The pointer technique is probably the most common. Array points out of the controller, and clicking a button will select what the user is pointing at. I will now describe the first gaze-enhanced technique. The first technique uses gaze sparingly. Gaze is only used to recognize the user's intention to interact with the menu. Then, the controller, in the other hand, can be used to move a cursor on the menu to select a new item. To better explain this video shows the technique in action. So when the user is looking at the menu, they can press the button and move a cursor. If the cursor is at the correct color, the mode is automatically selected. The second gaze technique, gaze button, is a common multimodal input technique found in the literature. It has a clear division of labor, so gaze is used to aim at the color that you want to select, and then you can click a button to activate the selection. And this is an example of it in action. So the user looked at the button, at the color, and pressed the button to select it. If it lies at the wrong color, the user can still move the cursor by controller movement. This is an optional feature. The third technique is dwell time. So here it is a completely eye-based technique. The user looks at the target and after 100 milliseconds it is selected. We found that the 100 milliseconds works quite well for our use case. Dwell times are typically higher to avoid accidental activation, but as the user has to bring up the menu anyway, it is clear that the user wants to select the color, and therefore we opted for the short dwell time. This video shows an example interaction of the dwell time. So a gray highlighting shows that the user is looking at it, and the green highlighting is the dwell time that confirms the selection. So our main research question is, what are all the trade-offs among the techniques? The techniques are essentially within the continuum between fully manual and fully eye-based techniques. So questions involve efficiency, physical exertion, user perception and experience. Our study is a within-subject repeated measures design with 17 users. We had 2 independent variables, the 5 techniques that we introduced before, and 2 menu sizes. The menu sizes were either 2x2 or 4x4 items. The actual size of the menu was the same. Only for the 2x2 items, there were shown 4 items, and therefore they were larger. As dependent variables, we measure the typical things like task completion time and arrow color selections, as well as physical aspects and qualitative ratings from the user. The experimental setup was an HTC Vive with an Tobii integrated eye tracker, and we adopted the task from Surreal's work in VR about mode switching. The task involves 3 steps. First, the user sees the color, and then they select the color mode in the menu, and then they draw a line between the 2 spheres. When they connected the 2 spheres, the task is accomplished. In the following, I will discuss the results. So, regarding task completion time, the overall finding is that dunk brush was the fastest technique, except for dwell time. So you can see in the numbers that dunk brush and dwell time have the lowest bars actually. And regarding the statistical analysis, we found that dunk brush was statistically faster than gaze button, cursor, and pointer. So clearly dunk brush is kind of the winner. However, it is also comparable to dwell time because there were no significant differences there. So dwell time represents an interesting alternative. What's even further interesting is that the pointer, which is like the most used technique in VR, did not fare specifically well compared to the other techniques. So we didn't find any significant differences, showing that there's a great potential for any of the pointer use cases to integrate enhancements using eye tracking. We then looked at the errors because the time is always relative to how many errors the user can do. And here we looked at how often users selected the wrong color. And a number of 0.3 means that every third time the user conducted potentially an error. We can see that gaze button led to the highest error rate, however also showed a lot of outliers. None of the results had any statistical significance, so we only visually inspected it and looked at the trends. The error rate for gaze button was surprising because we thought that the technique is quite reliable considering the Midas touch issue. However, even for dwell time, there were much less errors. We believe this could have something to do with the optional refinement feature. Because the users know they can refine it, they might have been less accurate in the initial selection. However, this has to be studied in future to better understand this issue. Third, we looked at physical movement, the movement per frame. Dunk brush showed a lot more physical movement here. So this has been shown in the left figure. Here the dunk brush technique has showed a lot more movement per frame than all the other techniques, and this was also backed up by statistical tests. Here, on the right side, we did not have any statistical significant results. However, we found a trend that all the 3 gaze techniques had lower motion for the larger menu condition. And this was a little surprising because it could mean several things. So first of all, users might just move less to stabilize the menu and make gaze pointing more accurate in this way. But it could also be related to eye-hand coordination. So for the manual techniques, there's a lot more coordination between the 2 hands involved, while the gaze-based techniques require more coordination between the eyes and the one hand. So it could mean that because there is no coordination anymore between the 2 hands, there might be less movement overall. However, this also has to be investigated in the future. At last, we looked at user ratings, and what became clear is that there's a trade-off between eye and hand effort. So gaze button and dwell time were found as more eye-tiring than all the other techniques, while cursor and pointer were found as more physically efforting than dwell time. So the second result is slightly surprising because we thought dwell time would be the technique that has the least physical effort than all the other techniques. However, it only was really pronounced compared to cursor and pointer. So why are cursor pointer specifically more effortful than, for example, dunk brush? And we believe this is because it integrates cursor movement. So even the pointer technique requires the user to point at a target, and you can see a little cursor moving. So both of these methods have this abstract concept of a cursor integrated, and this could potentially be more cognitive effort, which also could relate to the physical effort that users perceive. Okay, after all the findings, I want to give a short discussion on the main insights. First, we find DunkBrush is the easiest and fastest technique. This is quite expected, as it is an intuitive to use method. Yet, we find that dwell time provides an interesting alternative to DunkBrush. Performance data did not show significant differences, and users find it leads to less physical effort, although there is more eye fatigue. We also see lots of potential with gaze enhancements for the pointer. Pointer is the most popular technique in VR. Our gaze techniques performed similar, and each showed individual pros and cons. So there might be a lot of different use cases where our techniques may be interesting. Particularly, the most important part is the trade-off between eye and manual fatigue. Of course, this is strongly affected by our study task that requires a repetitive task design. It doesn't really align with real-world tasks where users would occasionally use a menu. So we believe that the effort that we found for more eye fatigue might not be really there when we interact in realistic applications. In conclusion, we find that VR provides novel, interesting sensing capabilities of the eyes, and there are also a lot of different ways of enhancing the user interface. We review trade-offs between gaze and manual interaction for many interfaces. We find that gaze enhancements are particularly interesting for pointer-based input paradigms because they are similar in their nature but provide subtle differences that could be advantageous to the users. Our focus was on menus, but there are other UI cases where it may be useful as well, such as object manipulation, typing, and so on. Thank you very much, and I'm now happy to get any questions.